So thank you so very much for coming, all friends and family of Danny. He has such an influence on all our lives. It's wonderful to see you all here. I'm Johan Leclerc. I'm a research fellow at PARC. I've worked with Danny most of my professional life. These slides were just a few of Danny's accomplishments. Thank you. One of the colleagues, Matt Klenk, will speak later, did a nice job. If we actually had a slide for every one of Danny's accomplishments, we would be here all day watching slides and it wouldn't repeat. The songs you just heard were some of Danny's favorites from Leo Brouwer and John Williams. I also want to say just that you don't have to video this. We're officially videoing this whole program, all the speakers, and they will be the videos will be available on a website a little bit later. Just waiting for a few more people to sit down. So soon after Danny passed, I had a dream, and it was actually a dream about doing this event. And I sat down, and Danny was sitting across from me, and I thought, "You're not supposed to be here. You're dead." And I said, "Okay, what am I going to say about you?" And he did this thing about, just twisted his head and said, "Just smile." Didn't tell me the answer. Which is typical Danny. But what that told me was Danny will always be with me. So Danny kept working, had an amazing career, and I want to just walk you through that a little bit. He kept working at PARC through this year despite his diagnosis. Now I know that we all know different parts of Danny. So he had a 60-year career. And what I want to do is, one of the things I want to do is briefly just go through that career. If I didn't do it briefly, it wouldn't happen. So Danny was born in 1935 in New York City. I was always amazed by that, but he would sometimes talk to me about, he had few stories about his boyhood, but one of the ones that sort of surprised me, he was unhappy during World War II, not because he didn't know anything about the war, but he said there was no rubber for balls. So he complained about that. He went to the Bronx High School of Science. You'll hear more about that later. And then he went up the Hudson River to, that's RPI, up the Hudson, and then he went up the river to Charles, a little bit too far, to Harvard. And then he finally got smart and went down the river a little bit and went to MIT. And he was, I believe his thesis on student, which is very influential. I learned about it. I mean, Marvin was on my committee too. Marvin Minsky was his thesis advisor. I think it was the first technical report from Project Mac, and you saw it described a little bit earlier in Matt's slides about one of the first very early attempts at natural language and solving algebra word problems from high school. Then that may be actually, I'll get back to this, that actually may be Danny's only, I don't know, solely authored paper. More on that. So then he became an assistant professor at MIT. I think it lasted for, I don't know, a year or two. So that was one career. So he had a career at MIT. And then in 1972, no, not 1972, in 1965, keep on forgetting, he's way back there, he went to Bolt Beranek and Newman. And at Bolt Beranek and Newman, he worked on he actually became lab manager pretty quickly of the computer science division, which, just think about it from PARC's point of view, he's a lab manager at 30, which is pretty impressive. He worked on 10X, which is the operating system for the PDP-10. He worked on BBN Lisp, which later became InterLisp and later fed into Common Lisp. He also contributed to Logo because Cynthia Solomon and Wally Fursag and Seymour Papert were there. And then he left and did a Fulbright at Edinburgh, so he had almost a year at Edinburgh. And then in 1972 he came to PARC. So he was basically at PARC. So PARC founded in 1970. So most of the years, he had so much history of PARC which we did lose. Anyway, so he knew everything. It was scary. So very quickly, he became an editor of the AI Journal, and the AI Journal is the premier journal in artificial intelligence. He was editor and editor-in-chief for over 20 years. He's probably the longest living editor. This is how I got the longest tenure. He helped me in all my papers. He read everything I wrote. He accepted everything I wrote. Also a paper which he accepted, but I could never thought it was good enough to publish, so I still have it as a tech file. And he was always bothering me until he finally gave up. I remember that Danny would get all these papers that sort of pseudo sucked, and he'd walk into my office and say, "Okay, see this paper here, what do you think of it? And if you don't like it, send me a 3-sentence review," which I did. So if any of you got nasty 3-sentence reviews, they're for me. Danny sometimes didn't like it bad news, so I got to write that. He also became chair of the Cognitive Science Society, and a couple years later, he was president of AAAI. He was a research fellow and an area manager at PARC. I think something happened at BBN. I've never heard the story. Maybe Rusty has it. He didn't actually ever want to be a manager again. And he grudgingly sometimes became an area manager here, but then he quickly stepped aside. Now, managing Danny, of course, was a really funny thing, because you don't know who was managing whom. But he was wonderful to work with. So during that time, he worked with knowledge representation language with Terry, and Interlisp, and Colab with Mark Stefik, who can't be here. He worked on Eureka, the knowledge sharing system, and PowerSet, which you'll hear about too, and recent DARPA program. So he has 3 completely somewhat distinct careers and very impressive impacts on the field. Let me say a couple of more things before I introduce other people. So what I've done for this event, is we've picked a couple of 6 speakers from different parts of Danny's life. If you took everybody, they didn't completely want to, I'd say this non-pejoratively, old gray white men. I tried not to do that. I tried to get a spectrum of people who've worked with him forever, which is like Bert and maybe Rusty, and also people who've only recently started working with him in the last 5 years, like Matt. Let me just talk a little bit about Danny, the collaborator, because I think that's there are people who are collaborators, and there's people who are sort of individual contributors. Danny's over here. I think that almost everything he did was a collaboration. Almost every paper was a collaboration. But he has such broad and deep knowledge. I would often just walk into I had a meeting or some visitors, or we had a brainstorm or something. I would just walk into Danny's office and I'd say, "Danny, come with me." You don't even have to tell him what it was about. He would get up, whatever he's doing, and come with me, and he'd participate in this brainstorm meeting, and he was really, really good at it. He made every idea that came up better. Now, sometimes he went off the rails, or he talked too much. And Danny and I had worked out a nice system, because our brutal worst to each other we do in private, not in public. So I would lay my hand on his shoulder, or I would lay my hand on his arm, and he'd stop, and that was a signal for him to stop talking. And the miracle was that he actually did. So that was, we had that working relationship. Delegation was always really funny with him. I try to delegate something to Danny, and I delegate, let's say, some report. I say, "Danny, would you write this for me, or do this?" And he'd say, "Well, what exactly do I have to do? What's the first paragraph? What's the second paragraph?" So it didn't work. Sometimes he'd say yes, and then an hour later, I discovered that Matt Klink was actually writing the report, and Danny was helping him write it, which I guess worked. Another thing about Danny, he's sort of my conceptual therapist. So if you look at the back of the program, there's a chair. And in that chair, that was my chair. I would walk into Danny's office when I was unhappy or dejected or couldn't figure something out, and I would plunk myself in that chair. First of all, I'd close the door, and then I'd plunk myself in the chair, And that masking tape you see, maybe from me gripping this chair, because I would sort of vent, not at him, but I would vent about whatever was going on that was really bad. And what I liked about Danny, he was always willing to listen, and he always had an optimistic view of the world, which sort of, I can get pretty negative, and he would pull me up, and then he'd complain about, why are you so negative? Yeah, well, okay. And intellectually, it was always great arguing with Danny. You know, people have become more polite over the years, but since Danny and I are both trained at MIT, we know how to argue, so sometimes we close the door, and he'd tell me I was full of shit, and I'd tell him he was totally confused. And then we have a wonderful conversation, because it wasn't personal, it was about getting ideas straight. And that was what Danny was. He was about ideas, and he was always in collaboration with other people. So what I've done is, let me take the first speaker. So it's a big number of speakers. So the first person I'm going to introduce is Tolga Kurtoglu. And Tolga, now what's interesting about Tolga is Danny and I helped hire him. So I remember sort of the hiring meeting and the hiring discussions we had. And it was a great choice, because we decided, well, you should be CEO of PARC.
In the hiring meeting?
So we could tell already you were going places. So it was an easy hire. So Tolga, the CEO of PARC, as of January 1st of this year, is going to give a little bit of talk about his experience with Danny.
Thank you, Johan. I appreciate it. Hi, everybody. I am Tolga Kurtoglu. I'm the newly appointed CEO of PARC. As Johan said, started January 1st, but I've been at PARC since the summer of 2010, and I had the privilege to work with Danny since pretty much my first day here at PARC. I don't have as many details as Johan had. I had the same kind of reflection as Johan when I thought about, what would I say, and what aspects to perhaps talk about. I didn't have a dream, but I thought about a few things. So I'm not going to go into all the marvelous things that Danny has accomplished as a scientist, and had a brilliant career at BBN and then here at PARC. But what I want to do instead is talk about two aspects from my experience. One more from an organizational point of view, and the other one more on the personal side. From an organizational point of view, as a new CEO and whatnot, I go off and I interact with other research agencies and government agencies and press and a bunch of other stakeholders and ecosystem players, if you will, in innovation. And they refer to PARC, they use different adjectives, I think, to refer to PARC: historical, legendary, iconic. Clearly, PARC as an organization and institution had its mark on the evolution of technology and innovation. And oftentimes what we overlook is the fact that institutions, any organization for that matter, are made of people. And they're actually the sum of the people that they have. And they are the people that they have. And if you think about from that perspective, all that brand reputation, recognition, academic credibility, and things of that nature is only accumulated because of the fact that we had people like Danny spending their careers here at PARC and working on all the wonderful things that they had worked on throughout their careers. So I truly appreciate that, and I think I can easily speak on behalf of the entire PARC community that we certainly appreciate that here at PARC. It's very, very important. On a personal note, Johan briefly touched upon this. Danny was a very, very important mentor in my life ever since I joined PARC. Like I said, I only got a few years, the privilege of working with him for a few years, but it was an amazing experience. Danny, taught me how to be a better scientist. He taught me then how to be a better manager and a better leader. And at all phases of my career here at PARC, he was one of the few people that I can go to and talk about pretty much anything. I did occupy the same chair that Johan mentioned earlier. I got my share of Danny time there. And the one thing that I want to highlight as perhaps the last note is not only he was very approachable and easy to talk to, an optimist, but he also was an excellent listener. And sometimes helping people and mentoring people is not about providing the answers to the questions that they have, but it's all about asking the right questions. And Danny was absolutely no exception to that. And he was always listening very carefully, engaging in the dialogue, and trying to understand and asking the right set of questions so that I or the other mentees that he had help with to really reflect on and trying to find the answers by themselves. So for that and for everything he had done for me and for my career, I would be forever grateful to him. Thank you.
Thank you, Tolga. So our next person speaking is Bert Raphael. Bert Raphael went to the Bronx School of Science, High School of Science, went to RPI, took a little delay before he got to MIT and saw the light, and has lots of embarrassing Danny stories.
Thank you. Now, that timeline is awfully similar to my own. So I'll tell you a few things. I was born in New York City in 1936 and went to the Bronx High School of Science. Bronx Science then and still today was one of the few schools in New York City that's not a district school, but rather has an entrance exam and takes students from all over the city. And Danny commuted from Queens and took the subway to school every day. And at Bronx Science, Science didn't have any significant sports programs, but they had a math team. And Danny and I and a group of other science nerds were on the math team for several years at Science. There was one young lady on the team who was one of the smartest, and several of us considered her Charlie Brown's little red-haired girl, unapproachable, but Danny actually dated her. And I'd like to welcome Joan, who's in the second row here. We've stayed in touch through the years. Joan and Danny invited me to some parties, and I had thought that parties meant funny hats and ice cream, and instead I discovered people sitting around in a circle playing guitars and listening to folk music from the Kingston Trio and those days. And I've had a lifelong connection with that kind of music ever since. In fact, I'm going to play in a old-time fiddle group later tonight. So that math team sort of got us started. To tell you what the times were like in our senior semester at Bronx Science, the chairman of the math department was fired because he had refused to tell the McCarthy committee in Congress whether he had been a communist in 1948. Joan and Danny and I and the whole math team went up to visit Dr. Lavity at his home in New Rochelle and show him our support at the time. In 1953, Danny and I both got into RPI and had a New York State scholarship, so we could afford to go. And as we were getting settled, we were going to be roommates in freshman dorms. And the first week, we got our assignments for the year in math and physics. So we sat down the next 2 days and did all the problems for the first year's math and physics. The method, which continued through our career together as physics undergraduates, whenever we'd have a problem, the problem would be presented to us, and I would look at it, and Danny would say, "This is the solution," and write down the answer. And I say, "How did you get there?" And he'd have no idea, but he just could intuit where we were going, and given the solution and the starting point, I was able to help fill in the steps to get there. So we were problem solvers together throughout college. We were active in the outing club. We didn't join fraternities. There was a big fraternity scene at RPI, and the outing club considered ourselves members of Gamma Delta Iota, the goddamn independents. We'd go hiking and snowshoeing in the mountains in the winter and cave exploring, and occasionally went to class, but we had a pretty good time in college. 1957, we graduated, and we both got a summer job at different branches of Boeing Corporation in Seattle. So, we made arrangements to get out there. Of course, we wanted to room together when we got there, but neither of us knew anything about Seattle, didn't know anybody in Seattle. And I was flying out, and Danny was driving, so he'd get there 3 or 4 days later. And we had a problem, how do we get together when in Seattle? The long-distance phone calls were too expensive. And we didn't know if there was, you go to a American Express office, but there may be a lot of them. I don't know which ones or where. And Danny came up with a scheme. When I got to Seattle, I got the latest white pages of the Seattle phone book and looked at the first 10 residential entries and called each one of them on the phone and said, "You don't know me, but when Danny calls, give him this phone number. This is where I'll be." And Danny got there 3 days later, and by his third call, he had my phone number, and we were back together. The next year, he went off to Harvard, and I went to Brown for an applied math program. I thought I'd be at Brown for a PhD in applied math for 4 or 5 years, and was starting to work there. And after a year, we got together. I ran into Danny on a college outing club reunion type camping trip, and he asked me, "What are you working on?" And I said, "Oh, well, I've got this project in the applied math department at Brown. I'm applying Waterman's integral equation to multiple scattering of elastic waves involving mode conversion." And Danny looked at me and says, "That doesn't sound very interesting." I says, "Oh, well, what are you working on?" And he says, "Well, I'm in this joint Harvard-MIT program. At MIT, they have a TV camera focused on the doorway, and the data goes into a computer and analyzes it, and whenever Marvin Minsky walks past, it recognizes his bald head, and a recorded voice says, 'Hello, Marvin.'" And the next week, I applied to MIT. So we're back together a number of years as roommates. We got together with a couple of other fellows. We had four of us MIT graduate students were roommates. We got an apartment together, but the apartment had 4 different bedrooms, and one where Danny said he really wants that one that's upstairs and has a big window and is light, and some of the others of us wanted to argue with him. So Danny and our friend, roommate Buzz, came up with a plan. We would take the total rent for the apartment, and each of us would divide it into 4 parts. How much are we willing to pay for each of the rooms if we got that room? I mean, Danny would bid 50% of the rent for the room he wanted and 1/6 for each of the other 3 rooms. I didn't care which room, so I put down 1/4 for each of the 4 rooms. And the other 2 roommates similarly made their assignments. Then we looked at the totals. Whoever bid the most for a room got that room. And since the total was then well over the total rent, he got it at a discount. We scaled everything back down. But that was typical Danny problem solving. In that room, Danny was a bit of a ladies' man. We had visitors come from time to time from various schools, and friends drop by. One night, for the first time, the young lady came and stayed with me for the night, and the next morning, Danny took her aside and said, "I'll bet you $1 that within 2 years you'll be married." And she said, "Oh, that's silly nonsense, but okay, she'll take the bet." My wife Ann is sitting over here. He was right. I saw Danny's friend Eileen come, and I would have made the same bet if I was bold enough, but it turns out that they got married pretty soon after we did. Our PhD theses turned out to be very similar to each other. We're both working under Marvin Minsky on applications of computers to symbol manipulation and on the early days of artificial intelligence. We finished our degrees about the same time, and just as MIT was putting together Project MAC, Machine-Aided Cognition or Multi-Access Computing, and they started a series of technical reports and said they wanted to take the PhD theses and bundle them and put them into Project MAC reports. And every day we would go up to Marvin Minsky's office and pull our theses out from the pile on his desk and put it on top so he'd get to it. And eventually, I think he got to mine first, and I went down to Project MAC, and the clerk there said, you know, we've got this new series. I think we've already assigned one, so yours is going to be MAC TR2. And the next week, Danny went down, and they got their act together and figured, no, well, they hadn't assigned any yet, so his will be TR1. So we were probably about the third and fourth PhD theses out of MIT. I wound up very soon in California. I didn't realize how much parallelism there is. I had a Fulbright fellowship to Vienna almost the same year that Danny did to Edinburgh. But I came out to California a few years later. Danny did. We've stayed in touch over the years. About 25 years ago, a friend at Stanford invited us both to join his poker game, and we've been playing every couple of weeks ever since and have stayed in touch. The last comment I want to make was in 2007. It was our 50th college reunion. Danny did not go to RPI for the reunion, but I did. I didn't particularly think about who was there. There were over 500 people in the class, probably 50 to 100 that came to reunion. I hardly recognized anybody, but at least 4 different people came up to me during that reunion mill-around time and said, hey, I remember you. You're Danny's friend. So Danny will be remembered.
Thank you very much, Bert. Next up is Don Norman. Let me introduce Don. I've known Don for years. He's anyway been in many institutions, but right now he's back at UCSD heading a design lab. Now, I checked quickly. You were born in the same year as Danny. Did you also go to the Bronx School of Science?
No, but my uncle taught there.
Okay.
Yeah, you know, Danny, I brought this jacket just to wear for you, but it's too hot. So tough, Danny, you're not going to get it. So yeah, this is sort of, Bert's had a lot in common with Danny. Well, gee, I was born in 1935 in New York City, in the Bronx, actually. I didn't go to Rensselaer, I went to MIT. Then Danny finally showed up at Harvard, so my first job was at Harvard. He went to MIT, finally, and actually in 1965, at Harvard, I took this wonderful course on natural language understanding. It was a summer session. And to my great surprise, 3 or 4 years later, Danny pointed out to me that he was one of the instructors in that course. And I said, no, you weren't. But I still had my notes. I went and I got my notes to prove that he wasn't. And not only was he an instructor, but I had lots of my own notes on his talk. Well, so much for his impact upon me. Yeah, he was the chair of the Cognitive Science Society. I was the chair of the Cognitive Science Society. He tried to teach me Lisp. Danny's a horrible teacher. Just horrible. Because basically, he couldn't imagine that anybody would have any difficulty. And when I struggled, and I could not understand Lisp, but just couldn't get it. It's one of those things where I had actually programmed I don't know how many algebraic languages, and I just couldn't get Lisp. And I finally, the way I learned Lisp was I taught it to my graduate students, and then one day it clicked. And then Danny said, well, what took you so long? So my memory of Danny is filled with lots of little things. We had a National Science Foundation joint meeting with the Japanese. We went to Japan for the meeting. And my memory of Danny is walking around the department stores. Now, those of you who've been in Japan know that the ground floor, the basement floor is actually the food court where they have all these wonderful foods. And they always, someone is standing up there with a little tray offering samples. You're supposed to walk by and take a sample. Well, Danny would walk by and see this tray being offered, and he would take the tray and walk away. Yes. He also got the best beanbag seats at PARC, and he also, Johann said he always collaborated. Yeah. I wrote 6 papers together with Danny, 5 papers just he and I. And the way we wrote it was that he would dictate and I would type. In fact, he wrote a couple of papers that my name isn't on them, but he told me how he hated to write. He just hated to write. So I would say, well, just tell me what it is you want to say. And he would say what he wanted to say, and I would type it. So that's how we collaborated. It's kind of what Johann said, right? When you assigned him to a committee, he would say, okay, now what do I do first and second and third? But what he was great at was I would tell him my idea and I might write it down, and he would be incredibly gentle at telling me how stupid it was and what I didn't understand and how much had already been done by other people. And the result was the work was dramatically better. So every time I worked with Danny, we did better work. I think that maybe, since I was a psychologist and he wasn't, that we sort of did better work than either of us could have done alone, because I did observations and he put in some science or whatever. But mostly the way we actually wrote our papers was we walked around Palo Alto and Menlo Park, and for a while when I lived in La Jolla, we would just walk around and looking around, and we would talk about anything that happened, especially the things that we would see around us. And then we would think about why we thought that was important, and then we would think about why that was different from something else we had seen, or maybe why it was the same as other things we had seen. And out of that would come some wonderful generalizations and some actually wonderful papers. And every one of our papers is of that sort. They're not about data, they're about, well, they're frameworks and speculations and approaches. And it was really a wonderful time. It's really, it was about a week ago when I had an observation. And it was really disheartening because my first thought was, I've got to call Danny and tell him about it. And that's how we did work. It was really a wonderful time. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. Well, he was nicer to you than he was to me. Our next speaker is Rusty Bobrow, who happens to be related, his Danny's brother. But I think I actually met you before I met Danny, right? Because I came to BBN in '73 and you were there. I think you're working on Lisp? Yeah. So Rusty has spent most of his career at BBN, and now you're running your own little company. Welcome. Hi.
Well, I hope you'll forgive me for bringing that down and putting the slides up here. I just wanted to make sure I could get through this, without breaking down and within the time span. Sorry. Try that. Okay. Well, compared to most of you folks who knew Danny at PARC, my professional and personal relationship was deep and over a long lifetime, but it was more sporadic, far too sporadic, as I wistfully realize right now. This has shaped my perspective, both in this presentation and in life as a whole. Johan suggested that I might be well positioned to capture Danny's professional accomplishments at BBN. And I started working on that and listing all the things. But rather than give a dry characterization of Danny at BBN, I want to capture themes that are evident both in his early days at BBN and later at PARC and tie them to their roots in our family. That's sort of a unique aspect of me. Danny was the oldest of 4 sons by far. The span between Danny and Ricky over there is almost 20 years. And Danny readily accepted his role as a leader and role model. Our father was a quiet man, a patent attorney, who loved science and technology, building and fixing things for people, and tinkering. Our mother was a true extrovert who loved people and the arts, and was always a fierce advocate in getting people what they needed to succeed and prosper, particularly her husband and her 4 sons. Yeah, quite amazing. It was the Tiger Mom before her time. The entire family loved language and ideas, though it was from our father that we all learned the joy of punning, much to my mother's dismay. Getting lesser. This was such a central part of Danny's character and sense of humor that even when talking was a major effort in his last months, he would often spontaneously engage in rather arcane puns and wordplay. Come see me or Kim afterwards, we can tell you some stories. Naturally, from this background, Danny loved people, he loved ideas, and he loved to create the tools and environments for people to solve problems. He made creative connections. As people have said, he was a collaborator and friend. And to me, he was always, no matter what else, the most wonderful brother. He was not only my older brother, he was a big brother in all of the best possible ways. While I never talked to him about this, I think that his experience as a big brother may have given him a head start in some of the marvelous character traits others have commented on. I was certainly one of the earliest beneficiaries of the skill that Terry called Danny the intelligence amplifier. I don't know what my intelligence would have been without him, but from my earliest childhood memories, he was warm, loving, humorous, and a fantastic listener. Clearly, he had successfully merged my mother's love of people and outgoing nature with my father's warmth and quiet ability to listen and to teach. He also joined my mother's fierce helpfulness and my dad's sense of justice. To comment about Doc Laverty, reminds me of that. Bonnie Weber, a colleague who couldn't be here today, passed on as her first thought. My memory of Danny is his never shirking from speaking up if he saw an injustice. And, sorry. Danny knew how to get people to do their best, to challenge them in ways that brought out their best efforts and creativity. Many people have said that Danny was a tremendous collaborator. He was also an instigator. Starting at BBN, he was always looking for the right tool to solve problems, his own and those of his collaborators. Most often, that tool was a computer program, a language, or a system. Building such tools was a complex task, and the key to his success in such tasks was his ability to motivate, guide, and collaborate with his colleagues. Early on, perhaps, he developed such strategies to motivate me, gently guiding my attention and interest in the intellectual pursuits that he was excited about, shaping my perception of what was interesting and challenging in a fashion that lasts until this day. Many colleagues have commented about the strong similarities in the way we approached intellectual problems, as well as the broad overlap in our scientific interests. Perhaps there's genetics involved, but I'm not sure. But certainly Danny played a more direct, if low-key role, both as a mentor and a beacon on my horizon. It's hard to think of moving into the future without without Danny's marvelous light shining out there. I was hoping I'd get through that sentence. When Danny went off to college and Rick was born, I moved into Danny's bedroom, discovering probably a decade of Galaxy and astounding science fiction magazines. I am still hooked on science fiction. When I learned assembly language programming in high school, Danny immediately gave me a copy of Vic Ingv's Comet programming language, which focused on how to use computers to understand English. Sometime later, he gave me a copy of the Lisp 1.5 manual I still have. After a summer it ran with Bert, I believe, he came back with papers by Newell, Simon, and Shaw, seminal contributions to what was just beginning to be called AI. I spent the next summer reading everything I could on the field. Again, I was hooked. That is a great quality. At MIT, my own interest in pure mathematics and later neuroscience led me to diverge from immediately traveling down the path he had blazed. But while academically I was a mathematically trained neuroscience, in my work life I've always been a computer scientist and most often an AI researcher. Danny's curiosity and love of new ideas made him a great foil for discussions in all areas. Whether in neuroscience or AI, Danny was a tremendous source of ideas and connections. He put things together in ways. He would listen to me describe an intellectual challenge. He would ask the best questions. Again, asking the questions. And more often than not, he would say, "Have you looked at," and citing some piece of research that I hadn't heard of, that on close examination would provide just what I needed to open up new and productive trains of thought. Sometimes in a direction I thought I was going, but often leading me into new ways of thinking about problems. He had a gift for that. Danny was a creative problem solver, and at this point I was about to talk about his use of whatever was available to hand, and I was going to tell the story that Bert told so well about what I characterized it as using network redundancy and diversity with people as the network to make the connection. But Bert, you did it better. So after receiving his PhD from MIT, Danny returned to BBN to restart the AI department, extending his dissertation work while leading a set of projects called Natural Communication with Computers. While his primary research interest was language and meaning, his creativity and problem-solving abilities were immediately focused on what would be a major sub-thread of his career: building the tools and computer environments to support the research of his colleagues. For the rest of his career, he simultaneously pursued leading-edge basic research alongside development of the tools needed to make such research successful. He found the best people, convinced them that working on these problems was exciting and fun, and was always an active collaborator, even more than a manager. He really didn't like being a manager. He got out of it as soon as possible. I learned that from him as well. His personal warmth and genuine concern for people, combined with his infectious enthusiasm for various research and technical challenges, helped him build an amazing group of collaborators in the fields that eventually became known as cognitive science. Over the years, he hired graduate students who quickly became recognized as world-class researchers, like Bill Woods, some here, Ross Quillian, Ron Kaplan, and John McCool, luring them perhaps by his infectious enthusiasm and unbounded optimism. Bill told me of visiting Danny at home when Danny's daughter Kimberly was 2 years old. And Danny said to him he expected them to be able to jointly build computer language capabilities that would keep up with her as she grew up. Well, we may not have yet lived up to Danny's enthusiasm, but arguably the group of people he brought together were the seeds for today's flowering of commercial natural language and speech systems. To complement his scientific colleagues, he hired equally world-class software engineers like Ray Tomlinson, the Atsign fame, and collaborated with various outside computer scientists to produce innovations in the deep internals of the Lisp system. He took Bill Wood's ideas for representing alternative parse paths in ATNs and collaborated in the design and implementation of spaghetti stacks, allowing compiled Lisp to efficiently support complex control structures. Starting with MIT's student Stan Murphy's software Paged Lisp on the PDP-1, he built a software team including Dan and Alice Hartley, already at BBN, and collaborated with them to produce the first few of an expanding series of Lisp implementations that eventually led to InterLisp. Meeting the challenges of developing very large, for the day, systems on computers with minuscule main memory, he led them to push the state-of-the-art in virtual memory and operating systems, going from software to hardware paging. His joint paper on 10x with Dan Ray and Jerry Birchfield was recognized in SIGOPS as one of the most influential operating systems papers published in the last 10 years, a number of years ago. He recognized from his own frustrations, including the errors caused by fast typing and the difficulties in tracking down arcane bugs, that programmer productivity was a primary limiting factor in building large systems. Danny hired and then continuously challenged, one might say goaded, his former roommate Warren Titleman to provide an expanding set of productivity tools he characterized as DWIM, do what I mean. Actually characterized it, do what Warren would have meant, but it was pretty good. It was arguably the world's first IDE, certainly one of the best. Not content to provide computer languages to support his own department, he collaborated with Seymour Papert, Wally Furtzig, and Cynthia, not gonna name, to revolutionize the teaching of computational ideas to young children, designing and then implementing the first version of Logo in Lisp. Another thing that not all that often mentioned, his friendship and enthusiasm helped bring Frank Hart to BBN. And from that seed, that grew the ARPANET and then the internet. So Danny wasn't, didn't invent the internet, but he certainly had an important role in getting it to happen. I could go on about what Danny did at BBN, a precursor of his even more ambitious and successful career at PARC. But through it all, he remained Danny. As Candy Seidner wrote to me, he was always creative, curious, fun, kind, energetic, eternally youthful. He was infectiously warm, and those are her quotes. He was infectiously warm and genuine, ingenious, and a true collaborative problem solver. He was the best friend one could have, and for a lucky few, the best big brother in the world. I miss him.
Thank you, Rusty. I'm curious, did he actually work for you? I mean, he actually your manager?
When I was, I only worked with Danny for about 3 weeks total.
Oh, okay.
When I was a grad student at MIT. I was a student at MIT and then a teacher at Irvine during the entire time he was at PBN.
Oh, okay.
But I, interacted with him over those times. Now, we split coast. I was in California and he was in Cambridge and vice versa.
And then we switched. Thank you very much. So our next speaker is Terry Winograd, Professor Emeritus at Stanford, who I think you were actually a PARC employee for a while, right? Weren't you? Or not?
Consultant and employee.
Consultant employee. You worked on KRL with Danny here.
It's great to see so many of you here. I start off from my own personal side because Danny is really responsible for my career in a very strong way. I was an undergraduate at Colorado College in 1966 when I stumbled across an article in Scientific American, and the lead to the article said, this is by Marvin Minsky, it's the author. At first, the idea of an intelligent machine seems implausible. Can a computer really be intelligent? In this article, I shall describe some programs that enable a computer to behave in ways that probably everyone would agree seem to show intelligence. Now, I'm sure the Scientific American editors made that much softer than the way Marvin would have actually stated it. But this is very intriguing. And so he describes in this article a series of programs that had been done in his lab at MIT at the time, before 1966. And one of those, of course, was Student, which was Danny's dissertation project. And in Student, it would take informal English phrase statements of algebra problems and come up with the answer. And that struck me as pretty amazing that a computer could do anything like that with English. I'm going to read a couple of quotes here, which I'll come back to later. One of the quotes from Marvin is, Bobrow's program is a model of informality. Its filing system is so loosely organized that new information can be added to the dictionary by dumping it anywhere. Okay, informality was a hallmark of Danny. The remarkable thing about Student is not so much that it understands English, but that it shows a basic capacity for understanding anything at all. And I was struck when I went back and got this article and read it, that Student was much more interactive than I remembered. What I thought was you fed in the problem and it fed back an answer. And it's got a dialogue in here in which you feed in the problem. The problem to be solved is the gross weight of a ship is 2,000 tons. If it's net weight, da 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 da. student types back, the equations are insufficient to find a solution. Trying possible idioms. Do you know any relationships among these terms? Gross weight, tear, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So even in this very early program, it was interactive. It wasn't batch processing of AI. It was really getting back and forth dialogue, which, as I say, I was struck when I recalled that from reading this. And again, that's Danny. He was interactive to the max. So the beginning of the story is I read this article. I said, that's for me. Wow, that's what I want to do. I'm going to go be like Danny, right? So I ended up going to graduate school at MIT, starting in Colorado, not the Bronx. And when I got there, I met him. I don't actually remember the first time we got together, but he came back to the lab very often to talk to Minsky, work on things. So I got to know him during the time I was working on my dissertation, which I finished a few years later in 1970. And then when he was coming out to create the group at PARC, he said, how would you like to come along for a summer project? Because I was still teaching, lecturing at MIT then. So the summer of '72, we came out to California, and I was just completely blown away by the stuff PARC was doing already by then, color graphics and all sorts of things that are part of the legend, as they say. In the next year, when my wife Carol was looking for a residency, a medical residency after finishing medical school, one of the places that she was considering was San Francisco. And I said, well, maybe I could come out here permanently, or at least for a while. We wanted to see if California really was somewhere we wanted to live, which it was. And so I came out and interviewed at Stanford, and they said, well, we don't really have a position because we have somebody here who already does exactly what you do. There was somebody who was doing natural language understanding, very similar, Roger Schenck. A lot of you who know the history remember Roger Schenck. But he's going to Yale for a year on sabbatical, so if you want to fill in, okay. Well, I said to myself, look, if he comes back and I lose that, then I've still got PARC, right? I can still go join Danny. So Danny really gave me the security to move out here. Now, the next story is Roger never came back. So I sort of slipped into his slot there at Stanford and have been there ever since. I was working at PARC with the group that Danny assembled, and I think the group really shows something about his breadth of knowledge and interests. So he and Martin, is Martin Kay here? Martin Kay. Martin Kay was a linguist. Ron Kaplan was sort of a linguist psychologist. Sharon Kaufman-Diamond was a psychiatrist, not a psychologist, a psychiatrist. Don was a psychologist. And I was working in a computer scientist to the degree that was thing. And it was clear that what Danny saw when he was putting together this group is that if you wanted to make progress, you had to have all those perspectives. You couldn't get a bunch of just linguists or just psychologists. And in a sense, he was really in the early days of forming the idea of cognitive science, the idea that all of those disciplines could merge together and get things done. So it was a great group to work in. We didn't actually get language as good as Kim does, but we had a lot of things that we did, and which eventually led, of course, to things like PowerSet and practical applications. Along the years, I remember being family friends. We would invite their family over to our house for Passover Seders. One memory I have, and I don't know if you guys have this memory, is being in the kitchen making square matzo balls. So I see Kim doing this, right? Just this year, my grandson Ellie and I made square matzo balls again. And I said, I used to do that with Danny's kids. So I got a chance over the years to see how Danny interacted in multiple domains, and have gotten different perspectives on that from my own work. So the past few years, I've been part of what's called the D School at Stanford, the Institute of Design, and it's looking at how you can build a base of creativity, innovation, and apply that to a variety of problems. And Danny was the essence, really, of what we're trying to do there. So I mentioned earlier that Minsky talked about his informality. Okay, that's part of the thing. You don't get locked into an idea. Danny was never dogmatic. He was always, oh, that's interesting, that might apply there. right? He was always making connections. He's always bringing things together, going off in new directions. And I think that was an extremely important part of how he succeeded. The other thing that we say at the D School is we have a mantra. When you're having a discussion, you don't say no or yes, but. You say yes, and. So yes, but is, okay, but I'm going to tell you what's wrong. Yes, and is, okay, I'm hearing you, and here's something else to do. And then Danny was the personification of yes, and. No matter what you've heard this from various forums from other speakers, no matter what you said, he was thinking about ways to go further, about ways to do more, not trying to cut you down, right, but really looking at it as a way to go farther. When I would meet with him, and this is something, again, you've heard several times, it was always amazing. I would just talk to Danny, and I would have so many good ideas. And that was the way he was. He wasn't possessive. It wasn't that it had to be his idea. But when you got into an interaction with him, the ideas happened. They came, and I think that was his real skill. I was thinking in a musical metaphor. He wasn't a soloist who would get up and play a big thing. He was a jazz improv guy who you would do a riff, he would do a riff, and then it would, in the end, there was beautiful music. Right? And it didn't belong to any one person or any one thought. It was really the process, the interactivity that was so important. Excuse me. So, I guess I only have concluding words here. I know that clearly, from what you've heard, I'm not the only one here who benefited over the years from those kinds of collaborations. I mean, there's so many people and projects and groups that have really owed their success to Danny's ideas and his enthusiasm. Right? He had a very long, very fruitful career. It's sad that we've now lost the opportunity to enjoy his always cheerful, optimistic spirit and bright inventions. But it's also an opportunity to celebrate how many people he touched and how he brought out the best in them. Danny, we miss you, and it was a great ride.
Thank you, Terry. Our next speaker is Valeria DePaiva. She worked, so I'm done with the old white men.
But you're going to put my slides up.
I'm going to put your slides up. So Valeria, much more recent, worked with Danny on the natural language. I thought my mic worked. I got
You got a different one? Oh,
it.
thank you.
Valeria worked at PARC for a number of years, and she's now working at Nuance, research scientist. There you are. I hope.
I hope to.
Okay.
Yeah, we're good. So, yeah, thanks very much for asking me to talk, Johan. And, you know, guys, I'm under strict instructions from Johan to be fast. It's less than 10 minutes, he says. Don't go on forever. So that's why I need the slides to keep me in the straight and narrow. Because it's very easy to carry on talking about Danny, as I think most of you already know. And as Johan was saying, I worked with Danny on natural language in the NLTT, the Natural Language Theory and Technologies, from 1999 to 2008, when I left for a startup. And I'm a mathematician as well, but I thought I was going to talk to a different side of Danny's personality. I mean, one that people have already started mentioning, the optimism and stuff like that. But I think the thing that I haven't heard people mention yet is this feeling that everyone here has, that you were Danny's special friend. You know, when he was talking to you, he was talking to you, and you know, you knew that he was there for you. And so that's why I call it Danny the champion of the world. So we started in 1999, as I was saying, and that was the KXDC project. KXDC stands for Knowledge Extraction from Document Collections. And Martin van der Berg, who's sitting over there, was kind enough to produce a photo, an old one, from the launching of this project. And through the years, I think, I am Brazilian, in case you haven't noticed, and my husband, who's sitting over there, is English. And we moved to the Bay Area in 1999, and we kind of had we're both coming from academic positions, so, you know, moving to the Bay Area, to Silicon Valley, we actually saw a completely different side of life, and we had all the ups and downs of Silicon Valley in this period. So in 1999, when we moved, there was the big boom, and then there was the bust, and I first heard about corporate layoffs and stuff like that. Then in 2002, Xerox tried to spun out PARC for the first time, and that was a long saga that carried on for a while. And we had lots of projects, lots of acronyms. KXDC was the first, then we had NIMD, the Novel Intelligence from Massive Data. Then we had Acquaint, Advanced Question Answering and Intelligence. You know, we had all these things that are part of the life of people here. And we had the big successes and the kind of bittersweet moments. So, one of the big successes was PowerSat, the spun out of the natural language technology. The technology kind of got more solidified and went up to San Francisco to become a proper startup. And on that thing, kind of Barney could talk better. But then we also, that meant also that the NLTT kind of, well, in a bittersweet way, ceased to exist. And at least we've managed to have a big Danny Fest in 2008. That's just before I moved out. And then another big party for Annie, who's sitting over there when she retired from PARC. So through all this ups and downs, I think one of the worst downs was when he had this TIA, the Total Information Awareness. I don't know if you guys remember that one. Point Dexter had this big program. And as I was saying, I'm Brazilian, so I'm used to the fact that the government promises you some money and then they don't give it to you. But I've never in my life seen the fact that the government sometimes actually want the money back, and that's what happened in that stage. So through all these ups and downs of projects that didn't work and projects that were almost there but were not, and stuff like that, I think Danny managed to keep his calm, clever, an optimistic way of looking at everything. And his office, I had lots more written here about kind of talking to Danny in his office, but Johan already gave most of the things. I just wanted to mention that, once I went there kind of feeling disgruntled about something that, I'm Brazilian, I can be Latin and very horrified about how things are working or not working. And I said to Danny, but Danny, I don't know how you manage to keep so calm and steady and collected with these things. Everything is going wrong. Everything is bad. And he looked at me and said, Valeria, we was here and Ron, because Ron is another one of these total optimists of life, and said, it's not that we don't see the bad scenarios. It's not that we don't see that things are not going as planned. It's just that we choose to concentrate on the silver linings. And that's what we are kind of trying to do right now, right? To concentrate on the silver linings, because, that was, to me, one of his biggest lessons, to me personally. Since then, I've had several needs to kind of remind myself that he's right, We can choose to concentrate on the silver lining. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Valeria. Our last young man, Matthew Klink, who has worked with Danny, is currently senior research scientist at PARC, and worked with Danny for the last 5 years or so. Matt?
Thank you, Johan. So yes, my name's Matt Klink, and I joined PARC about 6.5 years ago and started working with Danny almost immediately thereafter. We were working on a project focusing on giving feedback to designers about how their designs and vehicles would be performing in the world. And part of this project was dealing with abstract models, part of this project was dealing with actual designers and how they work in the workplace and in the world. And going through this, Danny was like the ideal collaborator for this, because as a sort of a note in the different things that we've been talking about, you're looking at somebody who's studied languages and how people represent things, both as in natural language as well as computer languages for his entire career. And so we're looking at how engineers actually do it in the world that they're working in. And also, Danny's always intrigued by how people build models about the world and how they're considering things that are happening. And that expertise became incredibly important at some point during the project. We're sitting here struggling, we're looking at how things are going, we're trying to see with our models why things are being progressed in the ways that they are. And we're sitting there, we're scratching our heads against the wall, and like I'm walking into his office every day showing him a printout of, the different trees and saying, this one's no good, this one's good. And he's like, why can't we figure this out? Why can't we figure this out? So, I don't know, after a long weekend, I show up and I say, hey, Danny, I got it. I show him the tree. He's like, that's really clever. Where'd you come up with that? I'm like, Danny, that was in your paper from 20 years ago. Couldn't you have just told me that already? So, working with Danny, I guess it was the first sort of close collaboration in my professional life, whereas we're both working together in Johan's group on projects. Of course, he's rather more senior than me, so there was obviously going to be some deference there. But I learned a lot about what it's like to work with him as a collaborator and how different people work differently. And so there's the stories about dictating papers and how he would always try to get you to do stuff, or I'd be writing reports that Johan would try to have me not writing. But for me, the most interesting thing was that Danny always had an open mind and always wanted to find the next interesting thing to do. And I am somebody who builds a plan and follows it. So for people familiar with the Myers-Briggs terminology, that's a J versus a P, and we're both about as far on that spectrum as you can go. So this leads to a pretty wonderful working relationship, because I'll be driving things forward and Danny will be making sure that we're getting the right problem solved, and we have to always be able to defend those things. But then getting back to Danny's optimism, that's really important. So even in the highest stress moments of those projects where I'm sitting there saying, we have a client coming next week and we have to have a demo that's working and all these different things, and I'm stressed out and pulling my non-existent hair out, he would still just come in and this may be aggravating because he wouldn't be helping me get the demonstration done and ready to be off my hands, but he would just start focusing on what's the actual most interesting part of the task at hand. And that would really remind you why you're doing what you're doing and the importance of doing so. And so then thinking about the next thing that makes Danny a wonderful collaborator in these over the last decade for me, his curiosity and just how much he loved working on understanding what was going on in the world. Any project, he wants to know what's happening. And so one of my favorite memories was working on a proposal with him in bioinformatics. Danny had some experience in bioinformatics. I'm a computer scientist. I had zero experience previous to this. And we spent every single day reading papers, talking about them, calling up people, meeting once a day, and just discussing how science was happening in bioinformatics, who was doing what kind of models were they building, how were they being represented, what experiments, etc. And the great part is that Danny knows everyone. And so therefore we could call anybody up, and everyone who we called up wanted to talk to us. And Danny would just ask question after question of them. And we could just learn so much about this field in such a short period of time. I think the last thing I want to say is a little bit about how his method of inspiration. And so we've talked a lot about how he builds people's ideas and makes them better. For me, as a young researcher, entering the research world it's different than it is when you're a graduate student. It's different as you are when you're a postdoc and you're sort of looking at the research world and trying to see where do you fit in this place. And so occasionally, I and some other young researchers here would just walk into his office and say, I'm not doing what I thought I would be doing. Like I didn't sign up for this. I want to be solving some other big problem that would take 40 years of me just working by myself. Why won't somebody give me money to just work by myself for 40 years? And Danny had this ability to through asking questions about what it is that you wanted to do, and through building bridges between what you said you wanted to do and what it is that you're actually doing, understand that you could really look at the problem that you're in that framework, and I'll miss that terribly, and it's been very motivational for me, and so I try to remember that going forward. So yes, I will miss his expertise, his optimism, his curiosity, and how he works with others. And I think it was really striking to me that when I told my wife about Danny's diagnosis, she looked at me and she's like, just like, what are you going to do? I can't think of you going to PARC and not interacting with him, and not. She can't think of this place. And my wife, who's been here only like 5 or 6 times, but she hears stories through me, and she's like, how are you going to go to work, and how are you going to do what you do? But already with me and the people I worked with, and people who've worked with Danny, we frequently and always will say things like, oh, I wish Danny was here for this, or we'll say Danny would nail this problem. So thank you all for your time, and I will remember Danny. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt. Now we're nearing the end. Now, you said something interesting. You wish Danny were here for this. Well, let's see. Whether going out of sleep and in sleep has. So let me give you Danny's response. So I bring you Danny.
I just want to thank all of you, because this room is filled with love and caring, as well as intellectual ferment, and lots of fun people to argue with. My favorite hobby. And I hope to continue to do that for many years. And in the context of this PARC, which has been really supportive of my reinventing myself without having to move. So, and you've all been part of this, so thank you very, very much.
So that was in 2008. It was actually right here in this room. I was lucky I found that. So that was at the 2008 Festschrift that Valeria helped organize, and that was just the right thing to say. Now, I know there's